A gunshot in the dead of night. For most folks, that's a reason to hide. For Caleb Ward, it was a memory he couldn't outrun, a ghost that followed him from the battlefields of the Civil War right into his lonely mountain cabin. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the smell of gunpowder thick in his nose. The dream was always the same: the flash of a rifle, the face of a man he never knew, the orders of a captain he knew all too well. But tonight was different. Caleb sat bolt upright in his bunk, and this time, the sweat on his brow was cold. His hand, acting on pure instinct forged in the fires of war, shot under his pillow and wrapped around the cold, familiar steel of his Remington revolver. He held his breath, listening. The wind howled through the pines like a mourner at a funeral, and somewhere far off, a wolf sang its lonely song to the moon. Nothing else. No second shot, no hurried footsteps. He told himself it was just the dream again, the same nightmare that had clawed at him for over a decade, ever since Antietam, ever since Chilton. He let out a slow, shaky breath and put the revolver back on the small table beside his bunk. The moonlight sliced through the single window, painting a silver stripe across the rough-hewn floorboards. It was a sparse life he lived. A table, one chair, a few shelves. This wasn't a home. It was a hiding place. A place to wait out the years until the ghost finally claimed him for good. He swung his legs over the side of the bunk. Sleep was gone for the night. It always was after the dream came calling. At 38, Caleb felt like an old man. The war had carved deep lines into his face and shot his dark hair through with silver. He'd taken a Confederate bullet in the shoulder, a wound that still ached when the weather turned cold. But the real wounds, the ones that festered deep inside, were the ones no doctor could see. The memories of the men he'd sent to their graves, the orders he'd followed, and worse, the orders he should have defied. He pulled on his worn boots and shrugged on a heavy coat. The embers in the stone hearth had died hours ago, and the Colorado chill had seeped into the very bones of the cabin. He stepped out onto the porch, the vast, star-dusted sky stretching out above him like a dark ocean. Far below in the shadowed valley, a few faint lights glimmered. Silver Creek. The mining town he avoided like the plague, only ever going down for supplies he couldn't grow or hunt himself. He lit a cigarette, the match flaring for a brief second, illuminating the haunted look in his eyes. The dream tonight had been about Chilton, a little farming community in Virginia. The war was almost over, but for the people of Chilton, the horror was just beginning. His commander, Captain Monroe, had decided to make an example of them. He'd accused 3 farmers of helping Confederate guerrillas. There was no proof, no trial. Caleb had spoken up, told Monroe they couldn't just hang men on a suspicion. Monroe had just laughed, a sound as cold and empty as a tomb. "We're not a court of law, Lieutenant Ward," he'd said, his eyes glittering. "We're the sword of righteousness." Caleb had watched them die. He hadn't pulled the lever, but he'd stood there in his blue uniform and done nothing. He'd let his silence make him a killer. After the war, he'd tried to go home, but the faces of those farmers followed him. So he drifted west, becoming a bounty hunter, using the only skill the Army had taught him was worth a damn: killing. But the more men he brought in, dead or alive, the more he realized that justice was just a word people used to get what they wanted. It was a sick joke played on the poor and the weak by the rich and the powerful. So he'd quit. He'd cashed in his last bounty, bought this remote piece of land, and built this cabin with his own 2 hands. He'd sworn off the world of men. For 3 years he'd kept that promise. Just him, his crops, the game in the mountains, and his ghosts. The cigarette burned down to his fingers. He flicked it into the darkness and turned to go back inside. But then he froze. A sound, faint but unmistakable, the snap of a twig on the forest floor. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate. Caleb's hand drifted down, resting on the butt of the revolver tucked into his belt. He melted back into the shadows of the porch, his eyes scanning the tree line at the edge of his clearing. He'd spent years learning to be invisible, to move without a sound, to sense danger before it had a name. And every instinct he had was screaming at him now. He wasn't alone. And the gunshot hadn't been in his dream after all. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Caleb remained perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow and suspicion. He strained his ears, listening past the whisper of the wind, trying to catch another clue, another mistake from whoever was out there. Nothing. The forest had gone silent, as if it too were holding its breath. A lesser man might have called out, or fired a warning shot, or even retreated back into the false safety of his cabin. Caleb did none of these things. He waited. Patience was a weapon, and he was a master of it. He thought about the town below, Silver Creek. It had exploded in the last few years, ever since silver was found in the hills. What was once a quiet trading post was now a loud, greedy boomtown. And sitting on top of it all, like a spider in the center of a web, was Judge Edmund Monroe. The same Monroe from the war, his captain, the man who had taught him the true meaning of injustice. Monroe owned the biggest mine, controlled the bank, and had the sheriff in his pocket. He was the law in Silver Creek County. Caleb had seen him once, from a distance, during a rare trip into town. The years had thickened Monroe's frame and grayed his hair, but the eyes were the same, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. Their shared history was a secret Caleb guarded fiercely. He wanted nothing to do with the man or the town he ruled. He just wanted to be left alone. But the world had a funny way of refusing to cooperate. Whispers slithered out of Silver Creek like smoke. Whispers about miners who organized for better pay and then vanished. Whispers about a newspaper man who asked too many questions about Monroe's land deals and was found at the bottom of a ravine. Whispers about people who crossed the judge and simply ceased to be. Caleb had always told himself it wasn't his business. He'd already fought one war. He wasn't about to start another. He'd chosen his exile, and he would stick to it. But the sound in the woods, that single deliberate snap of a branch, felt like a stone tossed into the still pond of his solitude. The ripples were spreading, and he had a sinking feeling they were about to wash right up to his door. He slowly, silently drew the Remington from his belt. The weight of it was a cold comfort. He didn't move from the porch. Let them come to him. Let them think the hermit was sleeping, unaware. He eased the hammer back with his thumb. The soft click was the only sound in the world. He scanned the dark wall of pine trees, his eyes accustomed to the gloom. He was looking for movement, for the glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel, for the outline of a man against the trees. And then he saw it. Not a man, not a threat. Something else entirely. A flicker of movement near the ground, about 50 yards from the cabin. It was small, struggling. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shape in the darkness. It looked like an animal caught in one of his snares. But he hadn't set any snares that close to the cabin. He never did. He knew better. A low sound drifted to him on the wind. A whimper. Not of an animal. It was human. A wave of ice washed through Caleb's veins. This was wrong. All of it. The gunshot, the stealthy approach, and now this. It was a trap. It had to be. They were trying to lure him out, trying to draw him away from the cover of his cabin and into the open. He remained on the porch, the revolver held steady in his hand, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He watched the struggling form for another long minute. The whimpering grew weaker, more desperate. It was a sound designed to prey on a man's conscience, and even though Caleb had tried to bury his, he found it stirring. He thought of Chilton, of standing by while injustice was done. The memory was a hot poker in his gut. Damn it. He knew it was a trap. He knew walking out there was the stupidest thing he could possibly do. But the sound of that helpless whimpering, it was the sound of the women and children of Chilton, weeping as their men were strung up from an old oak tree. It was the sound of his own failure. He couldn't just stand here and do nothing. Not again. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. All right, he whispered to the ghosts that were always with him. Let's see what kind of devil you are. He stepped off the porch, moving low and fast, using the shadows as his only shield, the Remington leading the way. He didn't head straight for the sound. That's what they'd expect. Instead, he circled wide, melting into the trees, becoming a ghost himself. He moved with a silence born of years spent hunting, both man and beast. His goal was to come up on them from behind, to turn their trap back on them. As he got closer, the whimpering stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. He slowed his pace, every sense on high alert. The smell of pine, the cold night air, the taste of fear and adrenaline in the back of his throat. He peered through a thicket of ferns, his eyes fixed on the spot where he'd seen the movement. What he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't a trap, not in the way he'd expected. It was a person, a woman. She was lying on her side, half hidden in the undergrowth. Her clothes were torn, her hair a tangled mess. One of her hands was stretched out, reaching for something. A small dead rabbit, its neck clearly broken, lay a few inches from her fingertips. She must have been trying to rob his snare line. But that wasn't what stopped Caleb's heart. There was a dark spreading stain on the ground beneath her, and even in the pale moonlight, he could see the unnatural angle of her leg. It was broken. Badly. This wasn't a trap. This was a tragedy. He started to step out from his cover to offer help, but then he saw something else. Something that made him freeze where he stood. On her wrist, glinting in the moonlight, was an iron manacle. And attached to the manacle was a length of broken chain. She was an escapee. And in this part of the country, there was only one man who kept people in chains. Judge Monroe. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The gunshot he'd heard wasn't a dream. It was the sound of them shooting at her as she ran. The snap of the twig wasn't an assassin coming for him. It was her, stumbling through the woods, wounded and desperate. She hadn't been trying to lure him into a trap. She'd been crawling toward the faint light of his cabin as her last, desperate hope. And if she was here, it meant they were still out there, hunting her. Caleb knew he should turn back. He should slip back to his cabin, bar the door, and pretend he'd never seen a thing. Getting involved was a death sentence. Monroe would send men, dozens of them if he had to. He would burn the cabin to the ground with Caleb inside it. The life of quiet solitude he had built for himself would be over, one way or another. He had come to these mountains to escape the world's problems, not to invite them onto his doorstep. He looked at the woman again. She had stopped moving. Her breathing was shallow. If he left her here, she would die. The cold would finish what the fall and her pursuers had started. He would be safe in his cabin, but he would know. He would know that he had stood by and watched another innocent person perish because he was afraid. He would be the man from Chilton all over again, haunted by the ghost of one more victim he had failed to save. His jaw tightened. He had run from his past for 10 years. He had hidden from his conscience. But tonight, his past had followed him home. There was no more running. He took a final, steadying breath, his decision made. Some lines, once you cross them, you can never uncross. But some lines needed to be crossed. He holstered his revolver and stepped out of the trees, his hands held up where they could be seen, just in case she was still conscious. Just in case her hunters were watching from the shadows. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and calm. There was no response. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. Her face was bruised and streaked with dirt. But even through the grime, he could see she was young. Too young for this kind of suffering. He gently felt for a pulse at her neck. It was there. Faint and thready, but it was there. He looked at the broken leg, the raw, bleeding chafe marks on her wrist from the manacle. A cold, hard fury began to build in his chest, an old, familiar feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. This was Monroe's handiwork. He was sure of it. He carefully gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of rags and bones. She moaned softly but didn't wake. As he stood up, her head lolled against his shoulder. He started back toward the cabin, moving as quickly and quietly as he could. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He was no longer a hermit hiding from the world. He was a man carrying a target. As he reached the porch, he risked a final glance back at the dark woods. He saw nothing, heard nothing, but he knew. They were out there. They wouldn't give up their prey so easily. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He laid her gently on his bunk, the only soft place in the entire cabin. The flickering light from the embers cast dancing shadows across her pale face. He needed to tend to her wounds. The leg was the worst of it. He'd have to set it, and that was going to be painful. He would also need clean water, bandages, and whatever medicine he had in his small supply. As he turned to stoke the fire, his eyes fell on the brand. Just below the manacle seared into her skin was a single elegant letter, an M. Caleb stared at it, the fury inside him hardening into something cold and solid, like granite. It was a mark of ownership, a cattle brand. Monroe hadn't just chained this woman, he had marked her as his property. In that moment, Caleb knew that his quiet life was over. This was no longer just about saving one woman. This was about settling an old debt, a debt that had been left unpaid since a sunny afternoon in Chilton, Virginia. He stoked the fire until it roared back to life, flooding the small cabin with warmth and light. He was no longer just a man hiding from his ghosts. He was a man preparing for war, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Monroe was going to bring that war right to his door. He just had no idea how soon. Caleb worked with a grim efficiency that came from years spent on the battlefield. He tore strips from his cleanest shirt for bandages. He boiled water over the fire. He found his small stash of laudanum, a powerful painkiller, knowing she would need it. Setting a broken bone was a brutal business. He gently cut away the torn fabric of her trousers to get a better look at the leg. It was a clean break, thank God. No bone piercing the skin, but the swelling was already severe. He looked at her face, still unconscious. Her features were fine, delicate, even under the layers of dirt and bruises. Who was she? What had she done to earn the wrath of a man like Judge Monroe? He pushed the questions aside. They didn't matter right now. All that mattered was keeping her alive. He uncorked the laudanum and managed to get a few drops between her lips. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to dull the edges of the agony to come. He took a deep breath. "Sorry about this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He took the leg in his hands, one above the break, one below. He pulled hard and steady. There was a sickening, grinding pop as the bone slid back into place. The woman's body arched off the bunk, a strangled cry escaping her lips, and then she went limp again, falling back into the darkness of unconsciousness. Caleb's hands were shaking. It had been a long time since he'd played doctor. He worked quickly then, fashioning a splint from pieces of a broken crate and wrapping the leg tightly with the makeshift bandages. He cleaned the cuts and scrapes on her face and arms as best he could. The manacle was a bigger problem. It was thick iron, locked tight. He would need tools to get it off, and that would have to wait. For now, he just tried to clean the raw, infected skin underneath it as gently as possible. When he was done, he pulled a wool blanket over her. He sat down in the single chair at the table, the Remington resting on his lap, and watched her breathe. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. But he couldn't sleep. He had to stand watch. He was a soldier on sentry duty again, waiting for an enemy he knew was coming. The hours ticked by. The fire crackled. The woman on the bunk occasionally stirred and moaned in her sleep. Outside, the world was silent. Too silent. Caleb's instincts were on fire. They knew he had her. They had to. They were probably just waiting for dawn, waiting for reinforcements. Monroe wouldn't send just a couple of men to deal with this. Not after what had happened in the war. He would send an army. As the first faint hints of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, the woman on the bunk started to stir. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, darted around the unfamiliar cabin, wide with fear and confusion. They landed on Caleb, sitting in the chair, the revolver in his lap. She flinched, trying to push herself up. A sharp gasp of pain escaped her as she felt the splint on her leg. "Easy now," Caleb said, his voice softer than he intended. "You're safe. For now." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Who are you? Where am I?" Her voice was a hoarse whisper. "Name's Caleb Ward. This is my cabin. I found you in the woods last night." She looked down at her bandaged leg, then at the manacle still locked around her wrist. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a look of weary resignation. "They were chasing me," she said, stating the obvious. "Monroe's men." "I figured as much," Caleb said. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a moment, studying his face, trying to decide if he was a friend or just another enemy. "Nia," she said finally. "Well, Nia," Caleb said, standing up and moving toward the stove. "You've brought a whole mess of trouble to my door." He started making coffee, his back to her. "Those men, they'll be back, and they won't be coming for a friendly chat." "You should have left me," she whispered. "Now he'll come after you, too." "It's a little late for that," Caleb said grimly. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one over to her. "Here, drink this. You'll need your strength." She took the cup, her hands trembling. "Why?" she asked, her blue eyes searching his. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Caleb looked away, staring into the flames of the fire. He could have given her a simple answer, because it was the right thing to do. But it was more complicated than that. He thought of the hanging tree in Chilton, of Monroe's cold smile. He thought of the brand on her wrist. "Let's just say the judge and I have some unfinished business," he said, his voice hard. "He owes me a debt, and I plan on collecting." Nia stared at him, a flicker of something new in her eyes. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't hope. It was curiosity. "You know him?" "From another lifetime," Caleb said, his tone making it clear he didn't want to elaborate. He walked to the window and peered out through a crack in the shutters. The sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees. The clearing was empty, but he knew it was an illusion. They were out there watching, waiting. "They're waiting for him," Nia said, as if reading his thoughts. "The judge. He'll want to handle this himself." Caleb turned back from the window. "What did you do, Nia? What did you do to make him hunt you down like this?" A bitter smile touched her lips. "I wasn't a very good piece of property," she said. "I refused to be broken. I was one of a dozen girls he kept at a private camp up near his mine. We were there to entertain his business partners, his guests." The disgust in her voice was palpable. "I wasn't the first to try and run, but the others, they were always caught. He'd make an example of them, to remind the rest of us what happens when you disobey." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. He had seen the depths of human cruelty in the war, but this was different. This was a slow, systematic kind of evil. "And the brand?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "A gift," she said, her eyes vacant, "for my 18th birthday, so I'd never forget who I belonged to." She looked directly at Caleb then, her gaze intense. "He won't just send men for me. He will come himself. He'll want to look you in the eye as he kills you for interfering." Caleb felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. She was right. This was personal for Monroe. It had been personal for over a decade. He walked over to a loose floorboard beneath his bunk and pried it up. He reached inside and pulled out a long, leather-wrapped object. He unwrapped it on the table, revealing a Sharps rifle, a big-game hunting rifle, the kind of weapon that could drop a buffalo at 500 yards. It was his prized possession, meticulously cared for. He began to clean and oil it, the familiar, methodical movements calming his nerves. "Let him come," Caleb said, not looking up from his work. "I've been waiting for him for a long time." Nia watched him, a dawning realization on her face. This man wasn't just a simple hermit. The way he handled the rifle, the look in his eyes, he was a warrior, a dangerous man. "You're not just a recluse, are you?" she asked softly. "Who are you, Caleb Ward?" Caleb paused his work, sliding a long, brass-cased cartridge into the breech of the rifle. The sound was heavy, final. He closed the action with a sharp clack. He looked at her then, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "I was his lieutenant," he said, "and I was there the day he became a monster." The revelation hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. Nia stared at him, her mind racing to connect the dots. The reclusive mountain man, the tyrannical judge, a shared past forged in the fires of war. It was a story far bigger and more dangerous than she had imagined. She wasn't just a runaway anymore. She was a pawn in a game that had started long before she was born. "Chilton," she whispered, the name of the town a question. Caleb nodded, his face a grim mask. "He called it justice. I called it a massacre. He ordered the hanging of 3 innocent men to cover his own crimes, and I stood there and let it happen." The self-loathing in his voice was a raw, open wound. I've been running from that day ever since. But you can't outrun a ghost, especially when it's your own. He finished with the Sharps rifle and propped it against the wall near the door. He then went back to the loose floorboard and pulled out a second revolver and several boxes of ammunition. He was turning the small cabin into a fortress. He'll think I'm just one man, Caleb said, laying out the cartridges on the table. He'll be arrogant. He'll expect me to be scared. That will be his first mistake. And his second? Nia asked, her voice quiet. Thinking I'm the same man I was back then, Caleb replied, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. The boy who followed orders is long dead. The man who's left, he doesn't follow orders from anyone. He handed her the second revolver. It was heavy in her small hands. Do you know how to use this? He asked. She nodded, her expression serious. My father taught me to shoot before he died. I can handle it. Good, Caleb said, because they're not going to knock politely. They fell into a tense silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. They were two strangers, bound together by a common enemy, a haunted soldier and a branded runaway, waiting for a storm to break. Caleb took up his position at the window, peering out at the silent woods. Nia sat propped up on the bunk, the revolver resting on her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Caleb's initial assumption that they would wait for Monroe himself seemed to be correct. It was a battle of wills, a siege of nerves. Around midday, Nia's stomach rumbled, a small, embarrassingly human sound in the heavy silence. Caleb gave a small, wry smile. Even fugitives have to eat, he said. He moved away from the window, keeping low, and began to prepare a simple meal of dried venison and hardtack. He brought a portion to her. Thank you, she said, her voice sincere, for all of this. Don't thank me yet, he warned. We're not out of this. As she ate, he saw the exhaustion catching up with her. The adrenaline had worn off, and the pain from her leg, combined with the lack of sleep, was taking its toll. Her eyelids were drooping. You should get some rest, he said. I'll keep watch. I'm used to it. She wanted to argue, to insist she could stay awake, but she knew he was right. She lay back on the bunk, the revolver still clutched in her hand. Wake me if... she started. I will, he promised. She was asleep in minutes, her breathing deep and even. Caleb watched her for a moment. She looked so young, so vulnerable. He felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have for anyone, not since his wife died of fever while he was away at the war. He had closed himself off from the world to avoid pain, to avoid attachments. But now this woman, this complete stranger, had shattered his solitude and reawakened a part of him he thought was long buried. He turned back to his post at the window, his expression hardening. He had let people down before. His wife, the farmers at Chilton. He wouldn't let it happen again. He would not fail Nia. The afternoon sun began to dip toward the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red. The forest grew darker, the shadows longer. It was the time of day when predators begin to hunt, and Caleb knew, with a primal certainty, that their wait was almost over. He saw the first sign of movement at the edge of the clearing. Not a man on foot, but a rider on a horse. The rider sat motionless for a moment, a dark silhouette against the dying light. Then another rider appeared, and another, until a dozen men on horseback lined the tree line, their rifles held ready. They weren't sneaking. They weren't trying to be subtle. This was a show of force, an intimidation tactic. And then a figure rode out from the center of the line. He was older, heavier set, riding a magnificent black stallion. Even from 100 yards away, Caleb recognized the arrogant posture, the confident way he held the reins. Judge Edmund Monroe had arrived. Caleb's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in his chest. He reached over and gently shook Nia awake. He's here, he said, his voice a low growl. Nia's eyes snapped open. She scrambled to sit up, her face pale. She looked past Caleb, out the window, and a small gasp escaped her lips. Monroe raised a hand and his men dismounted, spreading out to surround the cabin. They moved with a practiced discipline, taking cover behind trees and rocks. They were trapping him, cutting off any chance of escape. Monroe himself remained on his horse right in the center of the clearing, a king surveying his domain. "Caleb Ward!" Monroe's voice boomed across the clearing, a sound that scraped at Caleb's soul. "I know you're in there, Lieutenant. I've come for my property. Send the girl out, and I might just let you live." Caleb picked up the Sharps rifle. He rested the long barrel on the windowsill, the metal cool against his skin. He sighted down the barrel, centering the iron sights on the chest of the man on the black horse. His finger curled around the trigger. He could end it right here. One shot, one clean shot, and a decade of nightmares would be over. His whole body was tense, every muscle screaming at him to pull the trigger. "Don't do it," Nia whispered, her hand on his arm. Caleb looked at her, his eyes wild. "Why not? It's what he deserves." "Because that's not justice," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "That's revenge. And it won't fix what he did to you, or to me, or to those men in Chilton. It will just make you a murderer, just like him." Her words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. Killing him like this, from the shadows, would be an execution. It would be Monroe's kind of justice. He took a deep, shuddering breath and slowly, painfully, took his finger off the trigger. He eased the hammer of the rifle back down. "He won't leave," Nia said. "He'll burn us out." "I know," Caleb said. His mind was racing, searching for an alternative, for some way out of this impossible situation. Surrender wasn't an option. They'd kill him and drag her back to a fate worse than death. A shootout was suicide. It was 12 against 2, and they were surrounded. There was no escape. "Caleb Ward!" Monroe shouted again, his voice laced with impatience. "You have 1 minute to send her out. After that, my men have orders to set this cabin ablaze. Don't be a fool." Caleb looked around the small cabin, the sanctuary he had built with his own hands. It was about to become his tomb. He looked at Nia, at the fear in her eyes, but also the defiance. She had survived Monroe this long. She wouldn't break now, and neither would he. An idea began to form in his mind. A desperate, insane gamble. It was a long shot, with almost no chance of success, but it was better than dying here, choking on smoke. "Stay here," he told Nia, his voice urgent. "Bar the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me. No matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Nia looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What are you going to do?" "Something I should have done a long time ago," he said. He grabbed his revolver, checked the load, and shoved it into his belt. He took a deep breath. "I'm going to face him." Before she could protest, he unbarred the door and slipped outside, closing it firmly behind him. He heard the heavy bar slide back into place. He was alone. He stood on the porch, in the open, fully exposed. He raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. "All right, Monroe," he shouted, his voice ringing with a confidence he didn't feel. "You want to talk? Let's talk. Just you and me." Monroe stared at him from across the clearing, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He had won. The hermit had caved. He dismounted from his horse and started walking toward the cabin, his men holding their rifles steady, their aims all fixed on Caleb. Caleb stood his ground, his heart hammering, every nerve ending screaming. This was it, the final confrontation. He had no plan, no trick up his sleeve, just a desperate hope that he could buy them some time, that he could find a way to turn the tables on the man who had ruined his life. But as Monroe drew closer, his face becoming clear in the twilight, Caleb saw the look in his eyes. It was a look of pure, triumphant hatred. And Caleb knew with a sinking certainty that Monroe had no intention of talking. He was here for one thing and one thing only: to erase the last living witness to his crimes. Monroe stopped about 20 paces from the porch, his hand resting casually on the butt of the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. His men remained in their positions, a firing squad waiting for the signal. The air was thick with tension, a silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the pounding of Caleb's own heart. "Well, well, Lieutenant Ward," Monroe said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Look at you, hiding up here in the mountains like a scared rabbit. I almost didn't believe it when my men told me it was you who had interfered. I thought you'd have drunk yourself to death by now." Caleb kept his hands where Monroe could see them, His face was a stoic mask, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. The world's not that lucky, Monroe. Apparently not, Monroe sneered. So you've decided to become a hero in your old age? Stealing my property? Harboring a runaway? That's not the timid little lieutenant I remember. The boy who stood by and watched while I dispensed justice. That wasn't justice, Caleb said, his voice low and steady. It was murder. And you and I both know why you did it. Monroe's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Don't get self-righteous with me, Ward. You were just as complicit. You stood there. You did nothing. Your silence was your consent. I was a boy, Caleb shot back, his voice rising. I was following orders from a superior officer, an officer who was supposed to be a man of honor. But you weren't, were you, Monroe? You were just a common thief. That hit a nerve. Monroe's face darkened with rage. You watch your mouth, Ward. I am a respected judge, a pillar of this community. You're a monster who brands women like cattle. Caleb's voice cracked like a whip. And in Chilton, you weren't a soldier. You were a looter. Those farmers didn't die because they were traitors. They died because they saw you and your men stealing the town's silver reserves, hidden away from the approaching armies. You didn't hang them for justice. You silenced them. The truth, spoken aloud for the first time in over a decade, echoed across the clearing. Monroe's men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. They had signed on to be the judge's enforcers, not accessories to a war crime. Monroe's face was purple with fury. The carefully constructed facade of the respectable judge had crumbled, revealing the vicious killer underneath. You should have kept your mouth shut, Ward, he hissed. You should have stayed buried. I tried, Caleb said, a strange sense of calm settling over him. But you just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? You had to bring your filth up into my mountains. He lowered his hand slowly, deliberately. It ends tonight, Monroe, one way or another. You're a fool, Ward, Monroe roared, his hand now gripping the handle of his revolver. You're one man. I have a dozen rifles aimed at your heart. But they all follow your orders, don't they? Caleb said, taking a small step forward. And they heard what I said. They know what you are now. A liar, a thief, a murderer. Are they really willing to die for you? For a man who would kill his own to cover his tracks? He was bluffing, gambling that some of these men might have a shred of conscience left. It was a desperate play, and he knew it. Monroe saw the wavering in his men's eyes and knew he was losing control. His rage boiled over. Enough of this! He screamed, drawing his revolver. Kill him! Kill him now! But his men hesitated. They looked from Monroe, a man suddenly exposed as a fraud, to Caleb, a man standing alone, ready to die for what he believed in. In that split second of hesitation, everything changed. From the woods behind Monroe's men, a single shot rang out. It wasn't from the cabin. It was from the trees. One of Monroe's men cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. Pandemonium erupted. The men scrambled for cover, unsure of where the shot had come from. Ambush! One of them screamed. Monroe spun around, his eyes wild with confusion and fury. Who was out there? Who else knew? Caleb didn't waste the opportunity. He dove from the porch, rolling behind a stack of firewood as bullets chewed up the wood where he had been standing. He drew his own revolver, the cold steel of familiar comfort in his hand. The siege had been broken. The odds had just changed. He peered around the edge of the woodpile, trying to see who his mysterious ally was. He saw a flash of movement in the trees to the east, a figure holding a rifle, and then he saw another, and another. It wasn't just one person. There were at least half a dozen of them, moving through the woods like ghosts, firing with deadly accuracy, not to kill, but to wound, to disable Monroe's men. Monroe, caught in the open between the cabin and this new, unseen enemy, was panicking. His men were being picked off one by one, their cries of pain echoing through the twilight. His carefully planned execution had turned into a chaotic firefight, and he was caught in the middle. Who are you? He shrieked into the woods, firing his revolver wildly at the shadows. Show yourselves! A voice calm and clear called back from the trees. We're the people you thought you'd silenced, Judge. The husbands and brothers of the women you stole. The friends of the miners you had disappeared. We are Silver Creek's reckoning. Caleb stared in disbelief. The town, the people from the town had come, the whispers he'd heard, the disappearances, the quiet resentment. It hadn't just been talk. It had been organizing. A resistance had been growing in the shadows, right under Monroe's nose, just waiting for a spark to ignite the flame. His stand against Monroe, his protection of Nia, had been that spark. He saw his chance. While Monroe and his remaining men were distracted, firing into the woods, Caleb broke from his cover. He ran in a low crouch, circling around the clearing, using the chaos as his shield. His target wasn't the hired guns, it was Monroe. This had to end, here and now, between the two of them. He came up behind the large boulder where Monroe had taken cover. The judge was frantically trying to reload his revolver, his hands shaking with rage and fear. Caleb could have shot him in the back right then. It would have been easy, but Nia's words echoed in his head. That's not justice. It's over, Monroe, Caleb said, his voice cold. Monroe spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He tried to bring his half-loaded revolver up, but Caleb was faster. He kicked the gun from Monroe's hand, sending it skittering across the dirt. Monroe was unarmed. He was helpless. The two of them were alone, the sounds of the firefight fading into the background. You, Monroe spat, his face a mask of hatred. I should have killed you in Virginia. You should have tried, Caleb said, his own revolver aimed steady at Monroe's chest. All the years of nightmares, of guilt and shame, welled up inside him. His finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy to end it, to finally silence the ghosts. But then he looked into Monroe's eyes. He didn't see a monster or a demon. He just saw a pathetic, frightened man, stripped of his power, his true, cowardly nature exposed for all to see. Killing him now would be an anticlimax. It wouldn't bring back the farmers of Chilton. It wouldn't erase the brand from Nia's wrist. It would just be one more death in a world already full of them. Slowly, Caleb lowered his revolver. No, he said, the word tasting strange in his mouth. You're not going to die. Not like this. You're going to go back to that town you terrorized, and you're going to face them. You're going to answer for every single crime. You're going to face real justice. The fighting had stopped. The townsfolk, led by a grim-faced man Caleb recognized as the blacksmith, emerged from the woods, their rifles held ready. Monroe's surviving men, wounded and defeated, had already surrendered. They stared at Monroe, their expressions a mixture of disgust and contempt. His power was broken. His reign of terror was over. The blacksmith walked over to Caleb and Monroe. He looked at the judge with cold fury. We'll take him from here, Mr. Ward, he said. He nodded toward Caleb. We owe you. You showed us that one man could stand up. You gave us the courage to fight back. Two men grabbed Monroe, who was now sputtering incoherently, and dragged him away. As they led him past the cabin, the door creaked open. Nia stood there, leaning on a makeshift crutch, the revolver still in her hand. She looked at Monroe, not with fear, but with a cold, hard strength. Their eyes met for a moment, and for the first time, he was the one who looked away. The townsfolk rounded up the rest of Monroe's men. They would be taken back to Silver Creek, to a jail that was no longer run by a corrupt sheriff. A new day was dawning for the town, a day of truth and accountability. Caleb stood there in the quiet clearing, the smoke from the gunfire hanging in the cool night air. It was over. The war he had been fighting for more than a decade, both on the battlefield and inside his own soul, was finally over. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but underneath it, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt a flicker of something else. Peace. Nia hobbled over to him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. You did it, she whispered. You faced him. We did it, he corrected her, looking from her to the townsfolk disappearing down the trail with their prisoners. He looked at his small cabin, the silent witness to the night's events. It was no longer a hiding place. It was a home, a place where a stand had been made. What happens now? Nia asked. Caleb looked up at the star-filled sky. He didn't have all the answers. The ghosts of Chilton might never fully leave him, but they were quieter now. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a possibility. Now, he said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in years. Now we start living. The story of the hermit who faced down Judge Monroe became a legend in Silver Creek. They put Monroe on trial, and one by one, the people he had terrorized found the courage to speak out. The women from the camp were freed, and their testimonies sealed his fate. He would spend the rest of his life breaking rocks in a territorial prison, a fitting end for a man who thought he could own other people. Caleb Ward never went back to being a hermit. He and Nia found that they had saved each other in more ways than one. The cabin on the mountain became a real home, a place not of solitude but of quiet strength. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they no longer had the power to haunt him. He had faced them, and he had won. Justice, he learned, wasn't something you found or were given. It was something you had to make, with courage, with conviction, and sometimes with a gun in your hand and a righteous fire in your heart. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, what do you think is the true meaning of justice? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.